I'm an ecologist, and I was hired to do an ecological survey on the Yorkshire moors. I can't be specific as to where or for what organisation. But let's just say this changed my perspective of the British environment. I'll start from the beginning. I trudged through the Yorkshire moors, my boots sinking slightly into the damp peat. The wind tugged at my jacket. The landscape stretched out in front of me, the rolling waves of purple heather dotted here and there with patches of bracken. A kestrel hovered in the distance, searching for prey. The air was sharp with the scent of earth and vegetation, cool and fresh against my face. I wanted to appreciate it. Really, I did. The distant call of a grouse, the occasional rustle in the underbrush that made me glance down, hoping for a glimpse of a slow worm or an adder sunning itself on a rare patch of exposed rock. There was something undeniably beautiful about the starkness of it all, the way the moor stretched on endlessly under the wide open sky. It felt ancient, timeless. But there was a weight in my chest that I couldn't shake, a nagging voice that whispered, "This isn't right." The heather with its delicate mauve flowers was lovely, yes, but it shouldn't have been all there was. This place, this vast expanse of seemingly wild land, wasn't as wild as it seemed. Centuries of grazing and burning had kept it like this, stripped it of trees, its richness. Where there should have been forests, wetland, and open wood pasture, some areas dense with oak, maybe with pine in some. There was this open, windswept land. I paused for a moment, surveying the horizon. I can picture it as it would have been, teeming with life, full of the sounds of birds and the rustling of leaves. I could almost hear the creak of branches and the soft thud of an acorn hitting the ground. It should have been teeming with diversity, not just these hardy plants that clung to the poor soil. A lizard darted across my path, disappearing into the undergrowth, and I crouched down to where it vanished. "There you are," I thought, a flicker of joy breaking through the melancholy. There was still life here, small and resilient, clinging on despite everything. I watched for a moment, but the creature stayed hidden. Even that brief glimpse, though, gave me a bit of hope. But as I stood back up and resumed walking, the heaviness returned. I couldn't shake the thought that this place was a shadow of what it could be. A managed wilderness, a memory of something richer and wilder, now maintained by human hands for reasons long forgotten. As I made notes, I thought about how much work it would take to bring back those forests, to undo centuries of damage. I wondered if it was even possible. Certainly, over time, if we were to leave this place be, trees would spring up here and there. Perhaps in the future. The wind picked up again, and I pulled my jacket tighter around me. The heather swayed in the breeze, and I tried once more to lose myself in the beauty of it. But the knowledge lingered at the back of my mind, dulling the edges of my appreciation. As Aldo Leopold once said, "To see through the eyes of an ecologist is to observe a world of wounds." I spotted them in the distance, a small group of sheep, moving aimlessly across the moor. Their white fleeces were a stark contrast against the muted tones of the landscape, bobbing like misplaced clouds on the ground. They didn't belong here. Not really. They'd been left to roam, unmanaged and wild, their presence a constant reminder of why this land had remained barren for so long. Grazers constantly nibbling away at anything that tried to grow taller than a few inches. As I approached, something caught my eye. A patch of white that didn't move with the rest. A sheep, lying on its side a few meters away from the others. It was unnervingly still, and above it, a raven circled lazily in the sky, waiting. Instinct told me what I would find, but I walked toward it anyway, drawn by a grim curiosity. When I got closer, the reality was clear. The sheep was dead. Its eyes were open, glazed over, staring blankly into the distance. The smell hit me first. Sour, sweet, unmistakably that of decay. But there was something more to it. The carcass wasn't just dead from neglect or illness, as I'd expect out here. It had been ravaged. I knelt beside it, carefully examining the remains. Most of the flesh had been torn away, the ribs exposed, gnawed clean. The ground around it was disturbed, as if there had been a struggle. The usual scavengers had been here, but they didn't cause this. Something had killed this sheep. The raven above let out a harsh croak, almost as if taunting me, waiting for me to leave so it could finish what was left. I glanced back at the herd. The other sheep seemed nervous, huddled together, heads darting this way and that. They knew something had happened, something dangerous, and they were unsettled by it. My mind raced. Out here, in this bleak open space, predators were rare. Foxes, maybe, but this looked too brutal for that. And adult sheep are way too large for a fox. It wasn't like the slow decline of poor husbandry, where animals wasted away from neglect. This was quick, violent. My fingers brushed against a patch of dried blood on the ground, and I felt a chill run through me. Standing up, I scanned the horizon. There was no sign of whatever had done this, but the landscape suddenly felt less empty, less benign. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching, waiting. The wind whispered through the heather, carrying with it a faint hint of something primal, something that lingered here despite everything else. I made a few quick notes. Though my hands felt clumsy, my thoughts jumbled. This wasn't what I had expected. The sheep shouldn't have been killed like this. It was out of place, just like everything else out here. I took one last look at the carcass, then at the uneasy flock in the distance. They were moving again, slowly, but there was a tension in their steps, a skittishness that wasn't there before. I turned and walked away, the raven swooping down behind me, landing on the dead sheep with a flap of dark wings. Its harsh caw echoed in my ears as I moved further into the moor, my thoughts now clouded with a new sense of unease. As I was moving away, I heard the sound of footsteps crunching on the rough ground behind me. Instinctively, I turned and saw a man approaching. Stocky, dressed in a worn wax jacket and a flat cap pulled low over his brow. His face was etched with deep lines, a mix of age and weather, and his eyes were sharp, suspicious. "Did you kill my sheep?" His voice was gruff, no pleasantries, just the bluntness of a man who'd spent more time with animals than people. I let out a short, dry laugh, more of surprise than anything else. I waved a hand towards the torn carcass at my feet. "No," I replied, sarcasm slipping into my voice. "Does it look like I did this, mate?" He stepped closer, squinting at the remains, then back at me. His expression hard to read. There was a pause, and I could feel the tension in the air, thick and heavy between us. "What are you sheep doing all the way out here anyway?" I asked, crossing my arms. "This land's not exactly prime grazing." The farmer scowled, eyes flicking to the flock in the distance. Aye, they've wandered off, he muttered. They're not supposed to be here. Damn things have a mind of their own sometimes. Been meaning to fetch 'em back. He knelt down beside the carcass, his rough hands brushing over the exposed bones. For a moment, I thought I saw something shift in his expression. A brief flicker of worry, maybe even fear. But it was gone as quickly as it came. He straightened up and looked at me. So what do you think did this? I asked, watching him carefully. He'd been on this land a lot longer than I had. If anyone would know what might be lurking out there, it was him. The farmer scratched his chin, glancing around as if the answer might be somewhere in the heather. Could be a dog, he said. His tone wasn't convincing. Or a fox if it's desperate enough. But, I dunno. His voice trailed off as he shook his head. I frowned. Doesn't seem like the work of a dog or a fox. Looks too precise. I gestured at the torn flesh, the scattered remains, and the punctures around the throat. And the rest of your flock? They're spooked. He nodded slowly, chewing over my words. Ah, you're right about that. They've been jumpy lately, more than usual. Thought it was the wind or something, but he trailed off again, his eyes narrowing as he surveyed the moor. Silence hung between us for a moment, both of us lost in thought. I could see the gears turning in his head, the unspoken concern that something more dangerous might be out there, something neither of us could quite name. Finally, he sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. Whatever it is, it's not good. I'll have to keep a closer eye on 'em, try and get 'em back to safer ground. I nodded, though a part of me wondered if that would be enough. This land was changing, in ways neither of us fully understood yet, and this dead sheep, this uneasy flock, felt like a sign, a warning that things might be getting interesting. The farmer gave me a long, appraising look, then turned to leave, his shoulders hunched against the wind. Watch yourself out there, mate, he muttered over his shoulder. Things ain't always what they seem. I watched him walk away, his figure shrinking into the vastness of the moor. When he was gone, I looked back at the carcass, then out across the land. The raven had returned, pecking at what remained. The sheep was still in the distance, restless and wary. I took a deep breath and continued on, the weight of the encounter settling heavy on my mind. Whatever did this, it was still out there. As I began the long walk back to my car, my mind raced with explanations. The wind had picked up, whistling through the heather, and I shoved my hands deeper into my pockets, trying to block out the chill. The landscape stretched out before me, barren and endless, and yet it didn't feel as empty as it did earlier. Could it have been a dog? I rolled the thought over in my mind, trying to make it fit. Stray dogs did happen, especially in these remote areas, but something about it didn't sit right. The wounds on the sheep were too precise, too brutal. Dogs usually mauled their prey, tearing at it haphazardly, but this felt different, more calculated almost. The sheep were terrified too, more so than I'd expect from a single dog attack. It wasn't just panic, it was real deep fear, the kind that lingered even after the danger had passed. Then a darker thought crept on me. One I heard whispered in pubs and read in news stories over the years. Sightings of large black cats roaming the countryside. There'd always been talk, half-believed rumors, grainy photos, eyewitness accounts dismissed as exaggeration or fantasy. But they'd persisted, These stories of panthers, pumas, and other big cats living in the wilds of Britain, especially up here in the north. I remembered reading once that back in the 1960s, after the Dangerous Wild Animals Act was passed, some exotic pet owners decided they couldn't or wouldn't keep their pets anymore. The law required licenses and proper enclosures, and for some, it was just easier to let their animals loose. There were reports of big cats being released into the wilds, where they supposedly disappeared into the moors and forests, living in secret. It sounded absurd, like something out of a tabloid or a campfire tale. But then I recalled that a puma was actually caught alive in Scotland once, back in the 1980s. Her name was Felicity, and they kept her in a zoo for years. It wasn't a myth, it was real, and you can see her today at the Edinburgh Museum. As I walked, the idea became less far-fetched. What if one of those big cats had survived, managed to find others and breed, and now roamed these moors? The wounds on that sheep, they were far too clean, too precise, like a predator that knew exactly where to strike, unlike a fox or a dog. I found myself glancing over my shoulder, scanning the horizon for any movement, any sign that something might be watching me. The heather swayed in the wind, and I told myself that it was just my imagination running wild, fueled by far too many late-night documentaries and idle speculation. Still, the thought lingered. What if those stories are true? What if there really was something out here? Something that had managed to stay hidden all these years? It seemed impossible, but then again, nature had a way of surprising us. And this land, wild and untamed in its own way, might just be a perfect place for a predator like that to survive. I shook my head, laughing softly to myself. A big cat on the Yorkshire moors. It was ridiculous, wasn't it? But the sheep's carcass, the nervous flock, the farmer's unease, they all felt like pieces of a puzzle I couldn't quite put together. By the time I reached my car, the sun was starting to dip towards the horizon, casting long shadows across the moor. I unlocked the door, slid inside, and took a deep breath, trying to shake off the unease that had settled over me. The engine hummed to life, and as I drove away, the moorland stretched out behind me. I couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror. Maybe it was just a dog, I told myself again. Or maybe there was something more out here than I wanted to believe. Either way, I knew I'd be thinking about that dead sheep and the stories of big cats long after I left this place behind. The road narrowed as I left the open moor behind, winding through a stretch of small woodland. The trees closed in, their branches reaching over the lane, casting long shadows in the fading light. The evening was settling in, and the air grew colder, tinged with the early scent of damp leaves and moss. I flicked on my headlights, which cut through the dimness, illuminating the road ahead. A warning sign appeared on the side of the road, a yellow triangle with a leaping deer in the center. Watch out for deer, it seemed to say. I slowed the car down instinctively, not wanting to tempt fate by speeding through this stretch. The last thing I needed was to hit a deer out here in the middle of nowhere. As the car rolled forward at a cautious pace, my eyes scanned the edge of the trees, searching for movement. The forest was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. I started to relax, convincing myself that the sign was more of a precaution than anything else. Then, out of nowhere, a roe deer bolted across the road, right into the beam of my headlights. My foot slammed on the brake, heart lurching in my chest as the deer leapt past, its eyes wide with terror. For a split second I thought it was over, that I'd avoided disaster. But then I saw it. A large black shape, low to the ground, darting after the deer in a blur of speed and muscle. It was so fast I barely had time to register it. The two animals collided just beyond the reach of my light, their bodies tumbling over the side of a small hill that sloped down from the road. I lost sight of them as they disappeared into the undergrowth, but the sounds reached me clearly. The deer's frantic cries, sharp and panicked, echoed in the darkness. My breath caught in my throat, and I sat frozen for a moment, hands gripping the steering wheel, my mind struggling to catch up with what I had just seen. Then, without thinking, I threw the car into park and fumbled for the door handle. The night air was cool against my face as I stepped out of the vehicle, the sound of the deer's cries still ringing in my ears. The road was empty, save for my car's headlights casting long beams into the trees. I couldn't see anything from up here on the road. The hill was too steep, the underbrush too thick. But the sounds continued, now a mix of desperate bleats and low guttural growls. I moved towards the edge of the hill, my footsteps cautious, every sense on high alert. My pulse thrums in my ears, my mind racing with a dozen thoughts, none of them comforting. The black shape, whatever it was, it didn't move like a dog. It was too fluid, too fast, and those growls, they didn't sound like anything I'd heard from a dog before. I stopped at the edge, peering down into the darkness below. The deer's cries were growing weaker now, fading into the night, and the growls were more distant, as if the creature was dragging its prey further away. The underbrush rustled and snapped, then fell silent. For a long moment I stood there staring into the blackness, my mind spinning. This wasn't just some stray dog. Whatever I'd seen was something else, something that didn't belong here. I took a step back, suddenly aware of how vulnerable I felt out here, alone on that dark road. The woods felt different now, less like a quiet, sleepy place and more like a predator's hunting ground. The car's engine hummed quietly behind me, a reminder of safety, of distance. I turned away from the hill and headed back towards my vehicle, my heart still pounding my chest. Sliding into the driver's seat, I slammed the door shut and locked it instinctively. As I sat there, hands gripping the steering wheel, I glanced one last time at the woods. The night had swallowed the sounds of the struggle, leaving only silence in its wake. Whatever had just happened out there, I knew one thing for certain. It wasn't normal, not for these parts at least. Taking a deep breath, I shifted the car into gear and pulled away slowly, the road stretching out ahead of me. The headlights carved a narrow path through the darkness, but my mind was far from clear. The possibility I'd laughed off earlier, the stories of big cats roaming the wilds of Britain, they no longer seemed so ridiculous. As I drove, the thought lingered, gnawing at me like a splinter I couldn't shake. I could still hear the deer's cries in my head, and the image of that black shape flashing through the beams of my headlights burned bright in my mind. Something was out there, something that shouldn't really be there, and I was no longer sure if I wanted to know what it was, or if I wanted to make that knowledge public. We in Britain do not have a good history with predators. The wolves, lynx, and bears that used to roam these hills and hunt them, they were wiped out, all to preserve the precious sheep. Their notoriety and abundance made them targets, and eventually they were all killed. But if I keep my mouth closed, perhaps this creature, this animal far from home, could fulfill some semblance of that ecological niche, just as long as it stays in the shadows.